Welcome to this deep dive. We're jumping straight into, well, a really fascinating situation that's been unfolding out in Wyoming. You've got the state's Republican congressional delegation in this pretty direct exchange with over 100 judges and attorneys.
Yeah, and some pretty prominent names in that group too, right? Like a former governor, or even a former ambassador.
Exactly. And while, the immediate setting is Wyoming, the issues here, they really touch on much bigger questions, things that affect the whole country.
Absolutely. It's about the judiciary's role, separation of powers, real fundamental stuff.
So what actually kicked this all off? What was the catalyst?
Well, it seems to have started with an open letter from this group of legal professionals, over 100 of them.
Right.
And their main point really was this concern they have about what they see as growing attacks on judges, on the judiciary itself.
Attacks from who specifically?
Mainly figures allied with former President Trump. And a big part of the friction seems to be around these nationwide injunctions.
Ah, right. Those orders that can block government policies across the whole country. We've heard a lot about those.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially the ones used to block some of the Trump administration's policies. That's been a real flashpoint.
Okay, so the mission for us today is really to unpack this whole back and forth, understand the arguments from both sides, see what it tells us about, the current tensions in our political and legal world.
Right. And we're aiming to just lay out the different perspectives, not really take a side here, just understand what's driving this.
So let's start with the judges and attorneys. What was the core of their open letter? What were they demanding?
Essentially, they were calling on Wyoming's Republican delegation in Congress, Senators Loomis and Barrasso, Representative Hageman, to condemn these attacks.
Condemn them as unfounded?
Yes, condemn what they see as unfounded attacks and disinformation targeting judges and the whole system. They mentioned the post-January 6th environment specifically.
Any particular examples they highlighted?
They did point to criticism aimed at specific judges, like Judge James Boasberg. He was one of the judges who issued those nationwide injunctions against Trump policies.
So it wasn't just general concern, they had specific instances in mind.
Right, but it tied into this broader warning they issued. They talked about a growing, reckless disdain for the independence and security of our judiciary. That's a direct quote.
Reckless disdain. That's strong language.
It is. And they warned this is really erode what they called the American rule of law.
Wow. So the stakes as they see them are incredibly high.
Definitely. They even mentioned things like executive actions that seemed aimed at law firms seen as politically opposed, and then this wave of social media attacks on judges.
Attacks online? What kind?
They were concerned that some of it even seemed to encourage people to, just disregard court orders, which is obviously a huge challenge to judicial authority.
Yeah, that's serious. And you mentioned earlier the list of people who signed this letter was quite diverse.
Very diverse. It included people like Michael Sullivan, who was a former Democratic governor of Wyoming, and also Michael Sullivan, the former ambassador. Different people, same name, but notably spanning different political backgrounds.
That does suggest their concerns were maybe less about partisan politics and more about the institution itself.
That seems to be the message they wanted to send, that these are fundamental principles they feel are under threat, principles that should, transcend party lines.
Okay, so that's the perspective from the judges and attorneys. A pretty stark warning. How did the Republican delegation, Loomis, Barrasso, Hageman, respond to this public call?
Well, their response was, let's say, equally direct and pretty forceful.
How so?
They essentially said they wouldn't be pushed around. That was the phrase they used. And they characterized the letter writers as far-left judicial activists.
Pushed around. So they clearly saw the letter as, what, a pressure tactic?
It certainly sounds that way. Yeah, they seem to frame it as an attempt to intimidate them or score political points.
Did they object to the public nature of it?
They did. They expressed disappointment that this group went public with the letter instead of trying to have a direct conversation with them first. They felt that would have been, more appropriate.
Interesting. And did they offer a counter-argument based on their own view of the courts?
Oh, yes. They leaned heavily on constitutional principles, specifically citing Federalist Paper number 78.
Hamilton. The judiciary as the least dangerous branch.
Exactly. They quoted that idea that the judiciary lacks force or will, meaning the power of the executive or the legislature.
And their point was?
Their argument is that, in their view, judges are increasingly moving beyond that limited role. They believe judges are now effectively making policy.
Taken on force and will that Hamilton said they shouldn't have.
That's the implication. They argue that judges are imposing their own policy preferences without being accountable to voters, unlike elected officials. And they suggested this isn't just their view, but something many Americans are concerned about.
So it's an argument about judicial overreach, essentially. Unelected judges stepping into the role of lawmakers.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And to back this up, they actually quoted a law professor, Brad Snyder, from Georgetown Law.
What did he say?
The quote they used was, "The court does not have the last word on the Constitution."
Reinforcing the idea that judicial rulings aren't the absolute final say.
Right. It supports their view that there's room for other branches and the people, through their representatives, to push back or have a different interpretation. Senator Lummis was quite direct about it, too.
What did she add?
She basically said she represents Wyoming folks who support President Trump's agenda, and those people want their elected representatives making the laws, not judges imposing different views.
Okay, this really brings us back to those nationwide injunctions you mentioned earlier. It sounds like they are absolutely central to this conflict. Can you break down why there's such a big deal here?
Yeah, they really are key. So a nationwide injunction, just to recap, is when a single judge, often at the district court level, can issue an order that stops a federal government policy everywhere in the country.
Not just for the people involved in the lawsuit, but for everyone.
Exactly. And the Wyoming GOP delegation really hammered this point. They highlighted that they've actually co-sponsored a bill to try and ban most of these nationwide injunctions.
So they're trying to legislate against them?
Yes. And they were careful to say their concern isn't just about injunctions blocking policies they like or, Trump's policies. They frame it as a broader issue, something that affects policy changes across the ideological spectrum.
So they argue it's a matter of principle about how courts should operate, regardless of who's in power.
That's the argument they're making. They point out that it creates a situation where, say, one judge somewhere could halt a policy nationwide, impacting everyone, even if that judge's reasoning is later overturned.
Have others raised concerns about these injunctions? Is it just this delegation?
No, and that's a point they made sure to emphasize. They noted that even Supreme Court justices from different ends of the spectrum. They mentioned Justice Thomas, a conservative, and Justice Kagan, a liberal, have expressed reservations about them.
Really? Both Thomas and Kagan?
According to the delegation's response, yes. They referenced a Senate Judiciary Committee statement that apparently highlighted these kinds of bipartisan or cross-ideological concerns about the practice.
Interesting. So it adds weight to their argument that this isn't purely a partisan complaint.
It certainly aims to. It frames it more as a structural issue within the legal system.
It really does seem like we have two fundamentally different views of judicial power clashing here.
I think that's right. You have the judges and attorneys emphasizing judicial independence as essential for the rule of law, a check on other branches.
And the delegation emphasizing democratic accountability, the role of elected officials, and the potential dangers of judicial overreach.
Exactly. And, others have weighed in too. Jonathan Turley, the law professor from George Washington University, he made a comment that sort of reflects the delegation's concern.
What was his take?
He suggested judges should remember they are appointed, not anointed. Kind of a reminder that judicial power isn't unlimited in a democracy.
Appointed, not anointed. That's memorable.
It is. It captures that sense that judicial authority, while important, has its place and its limits.
And it's worth remembering, even the judges and attorneys in their letter acknowledge some level of public dissatisfaction, right? Didn't they mention populist sentiment?
They did, yeah. They acknowledged a populist sentiment for radical change.
Yeah.
So they weren't totally unaware of the frustrations some people feel.
But they drew a line.
They drew a very firm line. They insisted that regardless of that sentiment, this growing reckless disdain for the judiciary had to be resisted. And they explicitly said resisted by anyone sworn to uphold the Constitution, clearly including the delegation members they were addressing.
So pulling all these threads together, what's the fundamental tension here? What's at the absolute core of this Wyoming dispute?
I think it really boils down to a deep disagreement about the proper scope, the proper role of judicial power in our system. How much power should judges have, especially federal judges, to check the actions of the elected branches?
And this disagreement is obviously fueled by specific policy fights and, well, the general political polarization we see everywhere.
Absolutely. Those things pour gasoline on the fire. But the underlying questions about checks and balances, about judicial review, they're as old as the Republic.
And what's striking is that both sides seem to genuinely believe they're defending the Constitution.
I think that's fair to say. They just have very different interpretations of what upholding the Constitution means in this context, and very different fears about what poses the greatest threat to it right now.
It really makes you think. This whole exchange sparked in Wyoming shines a light on these really critical questions for the country.
It does.
When you look at the arguments, what does the situation suggest about, I don't know, the health of the relationship between the branches of government and how the public perceives the courts?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we find that balance? We need an independent judiciary. That seems crucial. But these concerns about unelected judges having maybe too much power, those aren't trivial either. They're clearly being voiced by elected officials, by scholars, and by parts of the public.
It's definitely not a simple answer, finding that balance between independence and accountability.
Not at all. And it probably forces all of us as citizens to think about where we get our information, how different viewpoints shape our understanding, and what we really believe the role of each branch of government should be. It's a conversation we need to keep having.
A lot to chew on there. Thanks for breaking that down.
You bet. Complex stuff.